Welcome to the Cluey Podcast, where we help conscious consumers like you get clueyed to the latest conscious tips, topics, and brands from impact-driven founders to experts and thought leaders on the topic at hand. I'm your host, Maryclaire Manard, founder and CEO of Cluey. Let's get clueyed in. Today's topic, how to impact change at a regional and local level. To discuss this, our guest today is Franz Trautmann, co-founder of Glass Half Full New Orleans, New Orleans' first and only glass recycling facility that recycles glass into sand for coastal restoration. They've been featured on NBC, Good Morning America, ABC, BuzzFeed, and countless more publications. Fran, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And tell us a little bit more about your story specifically and how you got started with Glass Half Full and how it came to be.
Sure. So I am from a small town in Louisiana. It's called Karen Crow. And I went to Tulane for university. I studied chemical engineering. And during my senior year at Tulane, my co-founder Max and I were drinking a bottle of wine out of a glass one night. It was a $2 chuck from Trader Joe's, something we did very often. But that night in particular, we kind of sat with that bottle more and thought about how it was going to end up in a landfill where it would never decompose because there is literally no glass recycling in the entire state of Louisiana. And so we just decided to do something about it and try to be a part of the solution instead of continuing to be a part of the problem of just throwing glass away and putting it in a landfill. And that's when we kind of cracked this plan to recycle glass into sand. Growing up in Louisiana, I've always heard about our coastal erosion crisis, how we lose a football field's worth of land every 100 minutes. And so we decided to kind of tackle these two problems with one solution by converting glass into sand and then using it for coastal restoration.
And I think that's the coolest part about Glass Half Full's story is that it has two significant impacts that are hyper relevant to the region. So first, as you already mentioned, glass recycling in a city that's known for having a good time and probably goes through our fair share of wine bottles, beer bottles, liquor bottles, you name it. But then second, as you mentioned, that extreme coastal erosion that we've been experiencing for decades now and has exacerbated things like climate and natural disasters. So I guess that's the beauty of building a solution in a region that you know and love is that you become hyper aware of its unique qualities and issues. But I'm curious, which of those two impacts, recycling or restoration, was the one that really motivated you to get it started?
That's a great question. I think overall, contributing to coastal restoration was always this incredible dream that we had. I mean, preserving our natural resources and potentially even building back land that we've lost over time is something that is near and dear to my heart and something that I love and is so important. So yeah, I guess like being able to recycle glass was just another added benefit of that. But we wouldn't have been able to do the coastal restoration without first recycling glass. So they can't be separated. But I think coastal restoration is something that is just like, it's so important, it's so impactful, and it's easy for other people to understand. You know, when you say recycling is important, a lot of people, their eyes kind of glaze over and they're like, nah. But when you're like coastal restoration, they're like, hell yeah, I'm in.
You know, that's great because that speaks very well to my next question, which is that it must have been really hard in the beginning to actually convince people to change their behavior and then ask them to pay for it, right? Because as I understand it, residents can either drop off their glass to be recycled for free or they pay for a pickup service because this is it's a private entity, right?
Yeah, so we're an L3C, which is sort of this hybrid between a nonprofit and a for-profit. It's a mission-driven business by, that's our fiduciary responsibility is mission and then business, which is kind of cool. And it's not in every state. So I feel lucky that Louisiana has that. But yeah, honestly, in the beginning, it was so easy to get glass. I think part of that is because we started literally a month before COVID hit, February 2020. Wow. And once COVID hit, everyone was drinking. Like it was just, everyone was drinking at home too. And so I think at that time, other people also sat with that more of like, oh, wow, if all these bottles and like, I'm just going to throw them away. I wish I could do something about this. In comes glass half full. But yeah, I think changing behaviors is always hard. But I think what we were able to do in the beginning is just really tap into people who already wanted that change. And we were able to just talk to people who maybe moved here from somewhere that did have glass recycling or had always been frustrated by the lack of glass recycling, and sort of like built our community around those people who already wanted to see this change.
Yeah, absolutely. And, COVID for all of the problems that came with it had some silver linings, in that all that extra time at home also created this itching for an outlet for action and impact, I think, because people were like, oh, that feels like the world is collapsing around me. What small thing can I do to make this a better place? So, being able to observe glass half full from where I was sitting at my vantage point, it was really cool, because I think it drove that change at such a hyper localized level when the world at a global level seemed to be falling apart.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think COVID made a lot of us look more inward of like, what am I doing besides just working and going to work? How am I contributing to my community?
Absolutely. And speaking of contributions, what to date have been some of the tangible impacts that have come out of the work that you and your co-founder and your entire team are doing at Glass Half Full?
Yeah, so to date, we have diverted over 3.3 million pounds of glass from our landfills. I just updated the statistics today. So that's pretty exciting. Again, we started in a backyard. Didn't think it would ever be this big. And now we're, next year we're like 5 million, 10 million, just getting more and more glass diverted from our landfills. So that's been awesome. We've also completed 2 coastal restoration projects. They each used around 20 tons of recycled glass sand.
Wow.
And we have a ton more scheduled for the upcoming year, which I'm really excited about.
Nice. Well, yeah, I'll mention where you can find Fran on TikTok later, but Fran's TikTok is chock full of awesome videos of their restoration projects and so much other cool stuff that they're doing at Glass Half Full. But I guess, in terms of moving forward, what does the future look like for Glass Half Full? Is it going to stay, super local to the region, or do you have plans to expand it?
We have big expansion plans. So
Okay.
short term, we do want to be able to expand throughout the state, and actually Louisiana and the Mississippi region. So ideally building out a hub that's in the greater New Orleans region that's able to recycle all of the glass in Louisiana and part of Mississippi. And then from there, ideally expanding to set up more hubs, probably along the Gulf Coast, but potentially in other parts of the US or the world. And figuring out areas that don't have glass recycling and that may also face coastal erosion issues, because the research that we're doing to prove the safety of using recycled glass sand in coastal restoration is already expanding to other areas. So we're already looking at Florida, Alabama, and Texas. And so ideally, moving our glass recycling operations to areas where we've been researching.
That's awesome. And for any of our listeners who aren't, aware of the coastal erosion problem that's very acute to the Gulf Coast region, in Louisiana in particular, and other states, we have what's called barrier islands. And as Fran mentioned, growing up as somebody from Louisiana, you're constantly learning about how you're losing so much of our wetlands, crucial ecosystems and habitats that essentially create a barrier during pretty important times like hurricanes, to actually maintain and keep every other piece of land more inland, more intact. So, this is a pretty big deal for this region in particular, not just from, of course, not wanting habitats and ecosystems to deteriorate, but for the safety of the region. Naturally, there are barriers in nature to help offset some of the impacts of things like hurricanes, which are obviously very familiar to the region. So, one thing that I'd like to point out too, if you don't mind touching on it a bit, is that Glass Half Full gets pretty active on social media during times of hurricanes. Can you talk about that a little bit and what y'all do around hurricane preparation and sometimes, hurricane reaction time and what you've done in the past?
Yeah, I think a lot of our work in disaster relief has just evolved around us seeing a hole. I mean, that's why we started Glass Half Full in general, is that we saw a hole. And we saw a problem that we wanted to solve. And that kind of happened naturally in the disaster relief space, especially after Hurricane Ida. But even before Hurricane Ida, we were still creating, because we create sand, we were able to create sandbags that we could donate to people before storms, because here we use sandbags to protect our homes and our businesses against flooding in the event of a flood event or a storm. And generally how the city does it is like they dump a bunch of sand on a parking lot and then you go and like shovel a bag. And we were like, oh, what if someone isn't capable of shoveling? What if they miss the deadline? What if they can't drive? And so we decided to create our own program that had already bagged sandbags and anyone could come and get them. No limit. If you needed a bunch, that was okay. And so we had already started that program, and then Hurricane Ida hit, which was extremely devastating to New Orleans. But what we really saw the devastation was in like the Bayou regions on our coast. And yeah, we had a relationship with the Pointe-au-Chien tribe that lives down there, and they were just completely devastated and didn't have the community support that was kind of already present in New Orleans. And so we were able to round up a bunch of volunteers, drive the hour and a half down there. And I think we ended up bringing like 600 volunteers down there over the course of a couple of weeks to help clean up, help organize supplies, just help with everything, because it was such a hectic time. There was no power, there was no water, and just so many things were destroyed. And so that's where we were able to just see a hole and kind of like fill in that gap.
Yeah. And it's that ability to see a hole that is such an incredible example with glass half full. It's thinking globally, issues that are global, such as climate change, but acting locally, taking that global issue head on at the local level. And there are people on Cluey and listeners and followers of Cluey who may be in a town far away, may not be, local to New Orleans or in the Gulf Coast, but who similarly want to drive impact in their communities. What would you say is your biggest piece of advice for somebody who wants to drive impact locally?
Yeah, my biggest piece of advice is always to, number one, if you see a problem and you have a solution, go for it. Don't wait to have the right degree. Don't wait to, have your business plan in place. We didn't have any of that. We were still college kids, and we decided to just go for it. And we learned so much because we just started instead of trying to wait and to plan. And also reach out to your community, tell them your ideas, start talking to people, start getting them involved. We would not be anywhere if we didn't have our community. We had so many advisors who were willing to give us their time and expertise to help us in this path, because every time we had a problem, we would tell people, we would reach out to the community, say, hey, we're struggling with this, like, do y'all have any advice? And then we're also able to give back to the community in times of need, like after Hurricane Ida. So it's all about like being active in your community ecosystem if you're truly trying to solve a problem locally.
And for people who are listening, whether they're in New Orleans or elsewhere, one other thing I'd love for you to speak to, Fran, in terms of giving your best tips, is as it relates to recycling, because sometimes recycling can get a bad rap for not actually being effective. And, we hear that a lot as it relates to plastic recycling, but what would you tell people or have them keep in mind for recycling materials in their home if they are trying to live a little bit more sustainably and impactfully in their own home?
Yeah, I think what's important and what makes it so hard to disseminate recycling education is that it's so different in every city, in every town, in every state. Like the rules are always different. And so my biggest piece of advice is to understand what your rules are. So for example, in New Orleans, we only accept plastics 1 and 2 in curbside recycling. And so, if again, not everyone also knows that plastics are numbered. So like only water bottles and things like that can go in your recycling bin. So if other plastics are in there, it's going to be an issue. Same thing with like, some people think you should put your recyclables in a plastic bag. In almost every city in the US besides New York City, you cannot have your recyclables in a plastic bag. That will clog up the machinery at the materials recovery facility, and that can cause a huge issue. And so understanding what the rules are locally, I know it's hard, I know it can feel daunting, but that is the biggest and the most important step, so that you're not causing more problems at the recycling facility than the good you would be doing by recycling.
Yep. Well, no, that's super important and a great and helpful tip for folks who are trying to do their best when it comes to recycling at home, whether it's plastics, glass, or aluminum. Well, we're at the end of our time here, Fran, and I always love to end the podcast with 2 glimmers of hope. So the first glimmer of hope question for you is, what is a new innovation in the world of impact that you're particularly jazzed about right now?
Of course, it would be recycling glass into sand for coastal restoration.
Great one. That's a great one. Any, you mentioned earlier some new research coming out about sand being a great restoration material, or glass recycled sand being a great restoration material. Is there something that people can learn a little bit more about that innovation? What's new or different about that?
Yeah, so it's never been done before. We're the first people to do it. And all of our research can be found at recycleforthecoast.org.
That's awesome. And then the second glimmer of hope question I have for you, because we are a consumer focused company and helping consumers make wiser choices when and where they can you rapid fire name 3 impact focused consumer brands that you absolutely love? And what is it that they make? What products do they make?
Ooh, okay. I love Blue Land for cleaning products.
Great.
I love Plain Products for like home and bath. And I love El Guapo bitters for the best, not just bitters, but cocktail mixers, syrups, and more.
Nice.
Local, woman owned.
Well, in full transparency, both Fran and I are locally based here in New Orleans. So our a good friend of ours is the one spearheading El Guapo bitter. So always great to buy local, support women-owned brands when you can. But that's great. Thank you so much, Fran, for coming on our podcast to get our followers clued in about changing individual behavior and impacting change at a local and regional level. And thank you to all of our listeners who tuned in for this episode of the Cluey Podcast. You can learn more about Fran and Glass Half Full at glasshalffullnola.org, or you can follow Fran on TikTok at EcoFran. If you'd like to learn more about Cluey, our top-rated brands, our ratings, you can find it all at clueyconsumer.com/about us. Come back next time to get clued into the latest in the world of conscious consumerism. And Fran, thank you again.
Thank you for having me.